So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm really, really honored to be joined by Eleanor Medhurst. Eleanor Medhurst is an independent lesbian fashion historian and the author of Dressing Dykes, an online blog about lesbian fashion history. She has degrees in design and fashion history at BA and MA level from the University of Brighton, and has also worked towards the sharing of queer histories through her involvement with Queer Looks and Queer the Peer exhibitions at Brighton Museum. Her first book, which is what we're going to be talking about this evening, is called Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion. This lovely book here, and it was published in June of this year, so not long ago at all. So just to let you know the structure of this evening, we're going to be talking for about 40 minutes about the book and about Eleanor's research, and then we're going to hand it over to questions. So if you've got any questions or something pops up while you're listening to the talk and thinking, I would love to hear more about X, then just keep it kind of in your head and then wait till we start the Q&A session to put it in the chat, because if not, the questions can get lost in the general chatter. So yeah, just keep it noted somewhere, and we'll come to that in a bit. So as you can see, on this screen, we've got this beautiful slideshow of images from Eleanor's book, and they are absolutely beautiful. So Eleanor, thank you for being here.
Thank you. No, it's such a delight. Especially because I've been doing so many in-person events. It's so nice to be able to reach some other people from so many other places.
Great. So let's go back to the beginning, if you will. When you were studying design and fashion history at the University of Brighton, was lesbian fashion history kind of your focus then, or did it come later? So just tell us about your path to this kind of specialism.
Yeah, so it kind of was my focus a little bit. I was really interested in studying queer fashion histories while I was studying during my BA and my master's. But I did want to focus on lesbian specifically, obviously as a lesbian. And lesbian fashion histories were stories that I was trying to uncover, but that I found quite hard to uncover just because there really wasn't much out there about lesbian fashion history. Particularly, there was hardly anything out there kind of put together into a narrative about lesbian fashion history, even if there's descriptions of what lesbians might have worn at various points in various different sources. So while I was doing my master's in particular, that was when I started looking at lesbian fashion history in a bit more depth, even though that wasn't kind of like my master's was in history of design and material culture. So there was a lot of other stuff going on, but I was always trying to hunt for lesbian fashion history. And while I was doing that, I did like an essay about the clothes worn by Anne Lister. And now I have a chapter in this book about the clothes worn by Anne Lister. And I wrote my master's dissertation on lesbian slogan t-shirts. And I also have a chapter about slogan t-shirts, and there's some coming up on this slideshow as well. So yes, I was looking at lesbian fashion on the whole, basically.
Great. And like for anyone that doesn't know who Anne Lister is, maybe just so we're all on the same level, you could just let everyone know who Anne Lister was and how, obviously they were such a crucial part of your research journey.
Yeah, so Anne Lister, a lot of people kind of refer to her as the first modern lesbian. Um, that's not necessarily completely true, but that's like a moniker that she's gained. And she was the inspiration for the TV show Gentleman Jack, which is how she's kind of been pushed into the public eye. But she was an heiress and a landowner, so she was a very privileged woman who lived in Britain in the early 19th century in Yorkshire and Halifax. And she wrote millions of words worth of diaries, a lot of it in code. And she talked about her life and the clothes that she wore in part, and her kind of adventures, I suppose, and also her love for women, which is why she's become such an icon within lesbian history.
Right, thank you. And actually just like this wasn't a question I had planned to ask, but just hearing you say that about the code, and that's something that you've written about on your blog as well, on Dressing Dykes. And maybe you could just talk a bit about what that means, what that concept of codes obviously within language, but within fashion as well. If anyone joined us for the talk we did last summer with Daniel Fountain and their book Crafted with Pride, Eleanor, you did a chapter in that one about t-shirts specifically, and the symbols and things like that. Maybe you could just talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the code used by Anne Lister was very much like a written code, like a secret code, that has been deciphered by code breakers, who have gone through all of these diary entries and figured out what she was saying, even though they're all handwritten and it could be very difficult at times. So lots of amazing work has gone into kind of deciphering that very literal code. But codes more generally in queer fashion history, queer history, lesbian fashion history are, from my point of view, I look at things like symbols and accessories in particular, and the ways that certain things are kind of woven into outfits or self-presentation in order to show an aspect of yourself. And often that aspect will be your sexuality or your gender or the kind of intersection of those things. Um, so in a lot of these come up throughout the book, and they can be very different depending on the kind of social context, the community, the time period. But things like specific rings worn on specific fingers, or certain flowers like violets being worn on a lapel, which was a popular thing in 1920s Paris, which was in turn a reference that lesbians in that context were doing, to appreciate and to honor the poetry of Sappho, an ancient Greek poet who wrote about loving women and wrote about violets. So that's another sort of code that you think that there's so many different examples throughout history up to the modern day. Oh, have I frozen?
It's just a little bit
Oh
patchy,
yeah,
but it's cleared now, I think.
yeah. Fingers crossed. Things like pride flag color palettes, I think, are kind of a modern day example of coded signaling.
Amazing. Thank you. And I mean, you just touched on it there. One of the things you talked about with the flowers, and you've written on your blog Dressing Dykes, and it's an article that I've used personally in my own research for my master's dissertation about queer quilting, about the color lilac. And yeah, this just to talk for a minute about your blog. I mean, Dressing Dykes is an incredible resource. Obviously the book is, that in kind of its published book format, but the blog is just kind of feels like this really, really rich space to read about, like, quite niche parts of material history. So where did Dressing Dykes come from? Were you kind of looking for a home for your research, or were you trying to reach a community, or a mixture of both? Tell us about the path to Dressing Dykes.
Yeah, I mean, Dressing Dykes as the blog started when I talked about my master's earlier. I finished writing my dissertation, and this was in summer 2020. There wasn't much else to be doing. So, encouraged by my wife, who was like, "You should write a blog." I was like, "I'm not sure anyone reads blogs," but I did it. She persuaded me, and I started sharing some of the research that I'd done initially throughout my master's degree, especially in kind of article formats, and then working from there as an independent researcher, doing more and more research on such a variety of different topics, which is then so many of them have led into what is now the content of the book, although there's a lot more there as well. Um, but I wanted to do the blog, and once I really started it and started to get some kind of engagement with it, this was really important to me because it was a resource that was accessible and that was about lesbian fashion history, which is something that's, as I mentioned earlier, is so rarely written about or researched. But that wasn't behind a paywall like so many of the sort of journal articles that I was using in the research that I was putting together. So much of that kind of source material was paywalled, and I really wanted it to be accessible for people. And that led into doing sharing that research on social media as well, on Instagram and on TikTok, because that was another way to make it accessible. and to help people engage with lesbian fashion history, which is at the end of the day what I really want from all of this.
And if you use TikTok, I would highly recommend Eleanor's account because
You,
it's really great.
I do my best.
So Unsuitable is your first book, and you just touched on it a bit there about how dressing dykes kind of led into that. Would you kind of credit dressing dykes as the main pathway to publishing your first book? What did that journey look like?
Yeah, I think very early on in doing dressing dykes, I knew that I wanted it to become a book. So I was kind of doing a lot of the research, keeping in mind ways that it kind of connected with each other and what narrative could be being pulled together there. Um, I was, as I mentioned, I started the blog summer 2020. I started the proposal for the book in late 2021 when I'd been doing like independent research for quite a while. And I continued to do the research like throughout the process of writing the book, but I started writing it after doing the proposal in the beginning of 2022, and it didn't have a publisher who was going to publish it yet, but I had an agent. My agent, Gemfee, is fantastic. So I think I'd written about half of it before a publisher went, yes, we're going to publish this, which because I knew I wanted to do it, I was like, well, it's gonna be out there eventually in some way or other. I'm going to write it. Um, but yeah, so many publishers were like, it's too niche. Like, how are we going to fit this into what we publish? Because it's such a specific topic. So that was kind of why there was a bit of time there. But yeah, so I finished writing it last May and it just came out this June. So
Yeah.
obviously there have been edits and stuff, but it's been kind of a long process.
And you're really lucky to have so many beautiful images in the book as well that kind of are just absolutely glorious to see. There's something about reading kind of prose about these histories, and you conjure a kind of mental image in your head, but then to see like tangible, like photographic evidence of what you're talking about is really, really special. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and
definitely. I think especially because it's fashion, like it means so much to be able to actually
mm,
see what it looks like.
yeah, 1000%. So one thing I wanted to you to talk about just quickly, because I think it actually really nicely summarizes like some of the things that go throughout the book is the analogy that you have right at the very beginning about the daisy chain. And I just think that's
Yeah.
such a good way to like introduce people to this book. So maybe you could just tell us about that really beautiful analogy that you make at the beginning of the book.
Yeah, I love an analogy. I love a metaphor. So that, if you read the book, there's quite a few, but I feel like they're telling the story that I needed to tell here. But with the daisy chain, I kind of said that imagine lesbian history as kind of the daisy chain, with each like life or story being the stem, and then the clothes are the petals that adorn it and that really bring it to life, which I just think is a nice way of looking at it.
So yeah, I think one of the things you make also is this idea about like it all being connected, but maybe not explicitly so. It's kind of, yeah, as we were talking about earlier with these codes, it's kind of these hidden underground, potentially
Mm,
quite ephemeral like modes of fashion that have kind of been picked up on but slightly kind of adapted to that
yeah,
person's context and culture.
absolutely. There's always so much kind of individuality behind what people are wearing, because ultimately it's like the almost our barrier between ourselves and the world. So even with the other inspirations that we bring into the way that we dress now and in the past, there's always going to be some element of our individuality and like speaking about who we are as a person and where we exist within our social context. There's just so much that can be kind of understood about people and historical lives through clothing.
And are there any examples that you came across in your research that you see is very much resonating with certain trends that we can observe today?
I Yeah, I think that sometimes there's just kind of the spirit of the thing, if that makes sense. Like, sometimes the clothes might be very different. Like on the screen now, we've got a picture of the ladies of Llangollen wearing riding habits, which was basically like clothes that women would wear during that period in the 19th century to ride horses. So it's kind of sportswear, and it was the most masculine clothes for women during the period. But lots of people who were lesbians or who might have been lesbians or something close to it would wear riding habits in like their day-to-day life. And I think that that's similar to the kind of stereotype of like the sporty lesbian, and the idea of wearing like sportswear as like a day-to-day thing, as like a style choice, even though the actual garments are like so different. So that's one kind of theme, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, and then there are some other things that have kind of continued throughout lesbian fashion history, kind of the mixtures of masculine and feminine in outfits, again, which can be so different depending on whatever social context it's within. Like from Queen Christina, monarch in 17th century Sweden, whose clothes were obviously very different from what we're wearing today. But I think there's still so much of an element of mixing masculinity and femininity in queer outfits and lesbian outfits today. And I also think there are some kind of codes and symbols, as I mentioned earlier, that persevere through decades, in particular things like rings, the ring of keys, or a carabiner pinned to a belt loop. There are just some things that continue to be kind of reinvented and reclaimed and reworn. So yeah, it's quite a lot of different things, really.
That's so nice. Do you think that now that we're in kind of a time where we can kind of, yeah, we have the research skills available to us to be able to look back and, like, as you were saying, kind of decipher these queer codes in fashion? Do you think that now we're in an age where these things are being done like intentionally and very openly to reference certain moments from the past? Do you think like that's the kind of new era of lesbian fashion history that we're in now?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that. And another thing that I wrote recently was an essay in the edited collection Queering Desire, Lesbians, Gender and Subjectivity. And it's on my shelf somewhere behind me. Um, and my chapter in that was Carabiners and Violet Tattoos, the desire for nostalgia in online lesbian space. And it was basically, the case study was like my audience on TikTok, where I post about historical lesbian fashions and codes. And I'd just noticed such a trend of people, particularly younger lesbians, going, I didn't know about this. I'm going to start wearing this. I'm going to get a violet tattoo, a lavender tattoo. Oh, let's bring the monocle back. All of the, even though that's kind of less of a possible thing, I suppose, for most people. But yeah, I do think that there is this idea of bringing historical codes back and reclaiming them and bringing them into the present day, and kind of creating a lesbian fashion narrative that is being brought forward into the future as well. That means a lot to a lot of people today, and a lot of lesbians and queer women in particular, especially because our histories have been so hard to grasp in the past, and even today for so many people it's like it takes quite a lot of looking to find them and to find out these things. So to kind of, I guess, wear a symbol of our history and the idea that we've always been here, and to like carry that around with you as part of your outfit, can be a really powerful thing.
Mm, that's really beautiful, actually, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really nice. I think it's a nice thing to be doing.
So I feel like this is probably quite an annoying question, and I don't want, obviously you don't need to dwell on it, but when you were researching this book, obviously the kind of challenges that we've just discussed about like the visibility of these histories in photographs and things, what kind of challenges did you find when you were researching not just this book, but like this topic in general, other than the kind of, yeah, having to kind of decipher things? Like, were there any practical things that made it difficult for you to research this book, or any access things like that?
Yeah, I mean, as an independent researcher, I didn't have funding. I I wasn't able to kind of go to archives on the whole. There's a lot of digital archives that I used, which are fantastic. And I looked at Glasgow Women's Library's Lesbian Archive, but that was because I had a grant to go and do that research trip for my master's dissertation that I wasn't able to do then because it was COVID. So I also, this is not, this picture has not changed in a while. Hopefully it will continue to play. I'll just hope for the best. But yeah, I did have some difficulties, I guess, just as being an independent researcher. And I didn't have, even though I did have access to some of these paywalled resources that I mentioned earlier, I didn't have access to everything. And part of that was because I was using my wife's university login to be able to access them. And if her university didn't have access to them, then that was kind of it. Occasionally I did put call outs out on social media, like, does anyone have this book, please?
Crowdsourced research.
Yeah. And sometimes I got people being like, yes, I have a PDF. So that was really, really useful. But other than that kind of practical difficulty, something that was just in general quite difficult was kind of balancing the representations within the book, just because so much of more recorded lesbian history and just history in general, the further back you go, is wealthier peoples. So a lot of the earlier examples are wealthier white women like Anne Lister, like Queen Christina, that's a landowner and a monarch. And then, yeah, even into the 20th century, many of the examples in the earlier decades are kind of wealthier lesbians, just because those were the people who had portraits painted of them, who had photographs taken, who were leaving diaries and letters. But it was obviously very important to me that there was a variety of different representations, whether it came to lesbians of color, working class lesbians, or anything else. So yeah, it was kind of making sure to go and hunt for those stories that aren't as kind of widely recorded or as accessible, or there's not as many resources about them, because like they matter, and history is made up of so many different kinds of people and so many different kinds of clothes worn by those people too.
I
Yeah.
also think like the book is so like all the stronger for that extra work to represent all these different types of histories, because every chapter kind of feels like its own book in a sense, because each of the
Yeah.
chapters are actually really different from each other, even though, as you say, it's got this kind of daisy chain effect going through it, that they all kind of had these common threads, if
Yeah.
you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice.
So yeah, I just think that even though that was a challenge, that was challenging, it like it really is worth it in that sense,
Yeah.
because it makes it
Yeah.
such a compelling book. Um,
Thank you.
were there any like stories that you wanted to be able to include but couldn't? Is there going to be like, are you going to maybe do something else with this research?
Yeah, so the thing that I'm working on at the moment is it's not specifically lesbian fashion. I'm starting to do some work on like a queer history of color. But that is drawing on a lot of the research that I kind of came across through writing this book and doing the blog, such as there's so much on the color purple and lavender, lilac, violet, in lesbian history and queer history more broadly. And I really wanted to look at that in more depth, and just look at color, because color comes up so much in fashion and codes and symbols, and then in art and culture and literature too. And yeah, so I'm starting work on that, but it's very early days. But I do also in the future really want to do a kind of more global look at lesbian fashion and lesbian fashion history. Um, and that's going to take quite a lot more research, just because of the availability of resources and like only speaking English and being able to kind of find those resources and learn about histories of cultures and countries that maybe I'm not so familiar with.
Mm.
And I'm also kind of interested in the idea of putting together something like that with help from other contributors, but then it's about kind of building that network. And yeah, that's my sort of long-term goal, is to really expand lesbian fashion history as kind of a subject area, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, and I think we didn't touch on this earlier, but when you said it is like, and also a comment that I get a lot with common threads is people being like, it's really niche, like this is so
Like,
niche. And I'm actually like,
yeah.
if you think about it, it's not actually that niche because, there's like thousands of people who are engaged in this subject. And I don't know if what people consider niche is basically something that isn't already in the mainstream, or, is obviously something that's like kind of slightly on the margins, but only in the margins for people who, or like basically kind of straight white men. It's considered niche for in the world that they've created, the world of media and history that they've created. But
Yeah.
actually I think for a lot of us, like craft or lesbian history or queer history actually like occupies quite a prominent part of our daily life, and that's not just like a few people here and there, that is actually thousands of people.
Yeah,
Anyway,
definitely.
I'm gonna round
I no, I think that a lot of people think of history as like kings and wars, but it's not. It's like everyday people who lived before us.
yeah.
There's so much to be said about like all of these like niche areas of history. It's like there's a lot to be said about it, and there's a lot that's important.
So my question for you is, if there's anyone that's come to this evening's talk because they saw the topic and thought, oh, I don't really know much about that, but it sounds kind of interesting. I'm just going to kind of go along and listen and see what it says, but is coming away from this thinking, I actually would really like to start looking into kind of lesbian or queer fashion history in general. If there was like a piece of media, like a book or a film or something other than your book, obviously, which is a great entry point, it doesn't require knowledge before you read it. But if there was something that you would recommend to people to get them started with this kind of like research or just something to delve into, what would that be?
Oh, I'm not sure. Honestly, some of my favorite things when it comes to like books in particular are, I guess, compilations of histories that are like compiling interviews with people who are talking about their lives, because it's such a kind of almost conversational way of finding out about history and about queer history and lesbian history. And something that I would recommend within that kind of genre is Now You See Me, Lesbian Life Stories by Jane Trays, which is a fantastic book about Jane interviewed a selection of lesbians about their lives in the UK in the 20th century. And it's just like, it's so kind of touching and personal.
Mm.
And yeah, and there's so much about people talking about their relationship with clothes as well, which is obviously fantastic.
Mm.
Um, else in a similar vein, Jill Gardner, From the Closet to the Screen, Women at the Gateways Club, is another fantastic book about all about like interviews with women who used to go to the Gateways Club in London, which was a lesbian club that ran from the 30s until the 80s. And there's again such incredible stories that come out of that, and I cite quite a lot of them in the book as well. Um, yeah, and there's also a documentary about the Gateways Club called The Gateways Grind, which is on BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK. Oh, there's so many. I suppose if it's like, there's books, there's like documentaries, there's all sorts of things. The El Dorado documentary on Netflix, which is about the queer cultures going on in Germany in the 20s and then what happened into the 30s, is also a fantastic resource if you're into documentaries. So
Great.
that's kind of a selection.
Yeah, no, that is an incredible selection, actually. I hope that that was helpful to some people. And maybe if anyone needs to follow up with anything afterwards, they always can do. It also reminds me that a friend of mine, Elizabeth Luther, is publishing a book this year or next year about lesbian phone lines. And I think it's called like Thank You for Calling the Lesbian Line or something like that. And yeah, that's coming out later this year, I think, or early next year. Don't quote me on that. But if this is something that's interesting, that new book might be of interest as well. So it does feel like kind of this topic is, yeah, it's really emerging, and luckily there's lots more being kind of brought to the fore in these kind of different pockets of history. So yeah, it's really, really nice to hear those book recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah.
So hopefully this is just the start for you, and we can kind of see more books coming from you. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask you about, like, you kind of touched on some topics that you would like to draw out more. But like if you kind of had a dream of like if someone said to you like, yes, okay, here's the funding to write another book, like now, like what are you currently reading? What are you currently interested in? Like what's on your mind right now in this area?
Oh, I've got to be honest, I'm actually writing the queer color book already. I just didn't want to big it up too much. So that's literally
You're actually
that's all that's
manifesting the
happening.
book being published.
Um, no, yeah, I am. I've written like 700 words of it. So I've writing is in kind of a loose term.
So color is kind
What
of
else
what's
have
on
I
your
read
mind.
recently?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, honestly, and this book's very much still on my mind. Like I've been doing the tour since the beginning of June. So after this is the second to last event, and then I'm in Manchester tomorrow. So after that, I'll be like, okay, Unsuitable, you can have a seat, have a rest, and let's look at some other things. What I really would like to do is get some more posts about like new areas of lesbian fashion history on the blog on Dressing Dykes soon. Hopefully this year I'll have at least a few new ones up, because I really want to just have some new things that weren't covered in the book, and for like people to just be able to access. So that's something that I would like to do.
Actually, maybe now we're on the topic of color, because I have just been like kind of obsessed with posting photos of this book to promote this event, and I'm like so obsessed with the colors on the cover. Maybe just talk about the colors that you've chosen to go with. The like, so this, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's like this kind of purple and hot pink cover. Tell us about the cover.
Yeah, I chose the purple. The purple was because, as I've mentioned, purple has such a long history in queer history, in lesbian history, lesbian fashion history, from violets with Sappho. Lavender, the Lavender Menace, is an excellent example, who were an activist group, um, who the famous feminist Betty Friedan had called lesbians a lavender menace within the women's movement. And a group of lesbians were acting out against this and infiltrated a feminist conference in 1970 in New York, all in t-shirts that they'd hand dyed and hand stenciled, hand printed, purple with the words lavender menace on them. Um, they apparently all had the same size of white t-shirt because they could only afford one box of them, and they dyed them in a bathtub, so very low budget. And yeah, they infiltrated this conference. The lights turned out in the hall that it was on, and they all snuck in with other shirts on top, and then they whipped their overshirts off, and were standing there in their handmade lavender menace t-shirts, which is just such a great story. I recount it all the time, where like purple and lavender is intertwined in lesbian fashion history. Um, so yeah, the purple is there. The pink was a choice, honestly, by the publishers, because I am very pink. But that I do mention pink in the book. In the final chapter, I talk about some of my own. It's the only time I talk about myself. I talk about some of my own kind of fashion choices, and how wearing pink as like a color with a lot of gender baggage attached to it feels very powerful as a lesbian to sort of reclaim and resist those color stereotypes. So yeah, that's kind of why pink and purple are the color themes for
Perfect. I think
Unsuitable.
that's such a good story behind a cover. Also, yeah, just like you are so synonymous with pink in my mind. It's kind of like a kind of color that
Yeah.
comes to my mind whenever I'm like look researching or writing or looking at anything that you put out, it's kind of like, yeah, just the pink aura in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. I've been wearing pink for quite a long time now. It would be weird. It would be I've been for this book tour, I've been incorporating quite a bit of purple, but
Good.
pink's always there.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, for answering my questions so eloquently and adding so much to like our collective understanding of your research and this topic. I really hope that some people have got some questions. It'd be really nice to kind of, if you want to, kind of say it out loud and put your camera on, you're more than welcome to. And yeah, if you have questions and you just want to put them in the chat, I can read them out. So I'm just gonna open the chat. I popped the book that Eleanor has also contributed a chapter to recently in the chat, so people can see that if they'd like to. But yeah, do feel free to put your questions in. They don't have to be academic or intellectual. All questions are welcome. Or if you've got something you want to let Eleanor know about that might be of interest, you can do that too. It always gives us a few minutes to warm up to questions. Okay, someone's asked, what was the biggest and best resource for these stories and images, or maybe your favorite resource?
Right, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen because there was a thing about it right in front of your face, and it was covering up your face. So I'm going to stop that now. My what was my best resource? Honestly, so many resources. My bibliography is huge. So yeah, there's quite a lot. Something that comes to mind though immediately is the Lesbian Herstory Archives in New York
Mm.
have in the 80s, um, Joan Nessel, who was one of the founders, recorded a bunch of oral history interviews, so recorded interviews um, with one of her close friends and someone who was very important to also creating. And Mabel Hampton was she was a lifelong proud lesbian, and she was also in the 1920s in the Harlem Renaissance a dancer and singer, and was really ingrained with all these fantastic queer communities and lesbian communities in the Harlem Renaissance in New York during the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And she lived there throughout her life, but especially during this very kind of renowned period. And yeah, all of these interviews are available for free online on the Lesbian Herstory Archives website. And I could just sit and listen to Mabel Hampton talk about her life and talk about the parties that she went to and the lesbian wedding that she attended and all of these fantastic things in her voice that's just had so much personality behind it. So that was definitely a favorite resource.
That's a good one. I've always wanted to go to those archives in New York because it's kind of laid out like someone's living room, isn't it? So
Yeah, yeah.
oh,
I've always wanted to. Sorry, it froze.
no,
We're
it's
okay.
okay.
We're okay.
So I'll just move to the next question. Someone's asked, did you encounter something during your research that utterly surprised you, slash something you didn't expect at all? That's a good question.
Oh, did I? I can't remember. I can't remember if there was anything that I really didn't expect. Something that did, I think, surprise me again in terms of like a primary source was looking at another fantastic online archive, the Spinboden Lesbian Archive, based in Germany. And they have digitized copies of loads of German lesbian magazines from the 1920s. And I was looking through all of them using Google Translate and my wife's help, who she can speak a little bit of German, trying to figure out what was being said in these magazines. But just like the extent of the lesbian and queer content in these magazines, even things like advertising lesbian club nights and like transvestite club nights, because that was a term that was in use at the time, and like themed parties and themed monocle parties and stuff like that. There was so much like life behind it. And yeah, I don't think that when I went, right, I'm going to try and find some scans of if there's any of these magazines that survive, I don't think that I knew how like personal and full of life they would be. So that was kind of a surprise.
And the next question, which is one that I'm also really curious to know the answer to, is who are your favorite lesbian fashion inspirations, current or historical?
Oh.
Maybe just-
Someone who is like constantly, oh, don't do this, Zoom, please work.
This is close to the
Someone
end.
who has kind of constantly been an inspiration. Yeah. Oh, I'm going to close the chat because I think that's making my side worse. Okay. Um, Someone who's always really inspirational to me is Natalie Barney, who was just, she was such an outlandish figure. And she was an American lesbian who was living in Paris in the early 20th century. And she had a lot of money. She was an heiress, but she spent that money very well. And she put on lesbian parties. She hosted feminist or like women's literary salons. Um, and always dressed in fabulous things, whether like couture outfits or like suits or like costumes inspired by Sappho. And she famously is recorded to have said, I am a lesbian. Being other than normal is a perilous advantage. So yeah, she's just such a, I kind of carry her spirit and her energy with me, I think. She's just so amazing.
Great. And we did touch on this at the start, but someone just asked what you studied for your BA and MA, but maybe they joined late, so maybe you could just tell them quickly.
Yeah, I studied both my BA and MA at the University of Brighton. Fantastic. I did fashion and dress history for my BA, which I now believe is fashion and design history, but it's like the same content. And I did history of design and material culture for my master's, again, also at University of Brighton. So if you're interested in study, I so recommend them.
Great. Catherine's asked, what was the best and worst part of writing your first book?
Oh, I mean, the best part was kind of just like doing the research and gathering it all together into this narrative and being like, great, this is like a history of lesbian fashion. This is what I wanted to find in the world, and I'm getting to put it out there. Um, and also, since it's been out, like seeing people respond to it and appreciate it, and being able to do book events and talk to people who are interested in the topic and sometimes who have their own kind of area of expertise, and being able to have those conversations has been amazing. I think the worst part honestly has just been, sometimes it's just been kind of a hard slog, like you're just sitting there on your own writing and writing and writing. And yeah, sometimes that could be quite difficult, but it's all worth it in the end. Makes me forget all of the difficult parts.
And another question was what is your favorite fashion book apart from yours, obviously?
My favorite fashion book. What is my favorite fashion book? I really enjoy, I have a book for, there was an exhibition at the Museum at Fit in 2019 all about the color pink and how it's been used in fashion, which is a really wonderful book, and like it's so visual as well, which is really nice. And I'm just like looking at my shelves and trying to think. I also have all of the, it's not like about lesbian fashion because like there's no other books about lesbian fashion, but all of the books compiling photos from, there was a Japanese street style magazine called Fruits, and we've got some like photo books of some of the street style photos from that magazine, and they're again such an amazing like visual resource. So
Nice.
yeah, two of my favorites.
So Liz asks, have you identified coded fashion accessories worn by femmes in history for being recognized as lesbian by other dykes?
Yeah, I think things like codes and accessories are definitely something that are relevant when it comes to like femmes or feminine lesbians in history, just because they're so often the way that those lesbians were being recognized and the way that they were the things that they were using to try and present themselves when the rest of their outfits might be read as more kind of mainstream or heterosexual. So things like, as I mentioned earlier, like rings and pinky rings, perfect to be paired with a more feminine outfit. Um, Violet pins on the lapel, such as in 1920s Paris, again, something that can easily be worked into a more feminine outfit. Um, so yeah, I think that accessories are definitely something that so many more feminine lesbians have lent towards in terms of codes, rather than things like suit jackets and trousers and like a full ensemble. It's like the accessories would sometimes doing some like heavy lifting in feminine lesbian fashion, but yeah, they could really do a lot to be recognized and to help people feel sort of affirmed within their community.
Mm, great. And we have a question that says, did different lesbian titles, e.g., femme, butch, stem, factor into the way that you researched?
Yeah, I mean, something that I wrote in the introduction of the book is that terminology is a tricky thing, just because in so many different contexts, different words are used, or no kind of identity labels are used at all. And it's hard to kind of create that narrative when words can be so different and labels can be so different. Um, Something that I kind of stuck to was using the word lesbian, because even when people might not necessarily have ever called themselves a lesbian in specific kind of time periods and stuff like that, my argument is that it's part of a lesbian history that reaches into the present, and we're kind of reading them as part of that lesbian history. And that doesn't mean that we're going, yes, they were definitely a lesbian, but they're still part of um yeah, a narrative that begins hundreds, thousands of years ago and carries on today. And I think that's true with other labels as well, trying to kind of be careful with them and use them when it's appropriate, but also kind of be aware that not everyone would have used them. Things like femme and butch, stud, all of these different label or yeah, okay, my Zoom went weird. All of these different smaller labels within the umbrella of lesbian are kind of, in some contexts it's like, okay, that person is butch or is femme or whatever, and it's a really important way to identify them and to talk about their life and the clothes that they wore. And sometimes it's more just being like, this person is kind of butch adjacent or femme adjacent, or they're feminine or they're masculine, or they fit into a kind of a narrative of butch fashion. And yeah, it was kind of just balancing the ways to talk about people, because yeah, ultimately it's like these are all individuals who led very different lives, so it could be hard sometimes.
Mhm. So I'm just kind of whizzing through these and finding it hard not to like respond to what you're saying, but I'll just do the question. So someone has asked, was there any kind of disparity between lesbians of different between what lesbians of different social classes wore? Were there overarching trends or codes that transcended wealth?
Yeah, I did find that sometimes there would be trends or codes or symbols that were different depending on class. And I think that the best example of that really is in the interwar period between World Wars One and Two. This is research done by a fashion historian called Katrina Rolli, who, for her like master's dissertation in the 90s, did a bunch of interviews with lesbians who were alive during this interwar period. Um, which is just it's such fantastic it's such fantastic like source material that I wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. And in these interviews, I think she had like three main respondents, and one of them was an upper class woman who said, yes, we all wore monocles. That was definitely a code that lesbians used. And then one or two of her other respondents were working class women who were like, monocles? We didn't do that. No one can afford that. Maybe if you were really wealthy. Which I just think is a great example of like, some people were like, yes, we all did this, when that was definitely not the case. And that like sometimes when looking at history, you've got to be aware of kind of the different class perspectives in particular, and the different privileges that people might have kind of color what they think is the truth, I suppose.
Mm, mm. And someone's said, not a question, but you touched on tattoos in lesbian fashion, which is what your chapter in the book that I put a link to above was about. And they've said, I'd love to see more about this on the blog. A beneath the skin slash dressing dykes episode would be the best thing ever.
Yeah, tattoos would definitely be a good thing to cover. I've talked about them a few different times on TikTok, but obviously that's like short videos. So that's a good idea. Maybe I'll do that.
And someone then said, could you repeat the name of the researcher who interviewed interwar lesbians?
Katrina Rolley. So that Rolley is Rolley. She doesn't actually. I've been in contact with her. She's got a copy of the book. She doesn't work as a fashion historian anymore, but her master's dissertation is like freely available online. So it's definitely worth looking at.
And we have a question that says, did researching such a niche topic cause you to question yourself or to feel burnout? What spurred you on to keep going? And they've also asked what in general started your journey, but because we talked about that quite a lot at the start, maybe you just answered a bit about, did you question yourself or feel burnout when you were, researching this?
Honestly, yeah, like sometimes like in the midst of it, it's like, oh, will this ever end? And you kind of lose faith a little bit in like, is it any good? But I would occasionally go back to bits that I'd written a while back, and I'd be like, this is great. What was I talking about? Which would cheer me up. And I think now that it's actually out, and I've had so many people saying such nice things about it, it's made me feel more like, yes, we can do this. But yeah, honestly, I think I was able to carry on doing it because I really wanted to. I really wanted to have this like a history of lesbian fashion book being out in the world. And I wanted to be the one to do it, like to be completely transparent. I was like, this needs to be done. And I'm working so hard on it. This book is going to be my book. No one else is going to do anything about lesbian fashion history first. And that's maybe more of a shallow reason, but it did keep me going sometimes. So yeah, now it's just tackling the being having that same perspective, I think, with the next one, and not trying not to get burnt out with it. So definitely something that I need to balance, I think.
Yeah. So do we have any other questions before we end this evening's event? Maybe we can take one more question if anyone's got one that they want to ask. Just give it a couple of seconds for people to put them in the chat. If not, we can wrap up this wonderful evening. It's been so interesting, I think, not just hearing about the topic, but hearing about you, Eleanor, and your journey to this point and your research. And yeah, I think like it's probably apparent to like anyone in this event that you are like such an asset to like queer history in general. And this book is obviously going to be one that like in 50 years' time, someone else will be writing a book about this and they'll be like, well, I remember reading Eleanor Medhurst's Unsuitable. And, I think this is going to start, it's going to send people down a lot of kind of rabbit holes, if you will, and start lots of research in new areas. So I think, yeah, it's really a book to treasure. And if you don't have a copy, I would highly, highly recommend you get one and read it. It's absolutely magical. And yeah, seeing lots of thanks and echoes of what I'm saying in the chat as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Eleanor. And yes, someone's just said they're already going to be citing Unsuitable in their dissertation. So the
That's
impact
so
is
nice.
immediate. Thank you everyone for joining
Yeah,
us.
no, thank you so much, everyone.
Great. And I'll just stop the
Oh,
recording now. If I can find the
yeah.
button.